so many really cool pieces that we can put together. Like, quite frankly, now that I'm not a founder anymore, I luckily have a few hours of free time, and I try to dedicate that just to like build on some of this stuff. Like some of these like stablecoin payment SDKs are like insane. Like it's far easier than ever to like deploy a smart contract or integrate a smart contract and combine a bunch of them together. And so we can start doing some like wacky shit. And I'm just like hoping for people who feel the same way as myself to just like start experimenting.
Welcome back to another episode of Talking Intentionally. Today we're speaking with Jim from LiFi. Jim is one of the founders of Catalyst, and today he speaks with Ash about his journey in crypto, his thoughts on intents and solvers, and where he sees the industry going from here. I really hope you enjoy this episode, and as always, let me know if you have any feedback in the comment section below.
Hey, what's up, everyone? This is Ash from Axel, bringing you another episode of the Talking Intentionally podcast. I think this is going to be one of the better episodes that we have because we got Jim from LiFi, formerly Jim from Catalyst. And I think when you think about people killing it in the intents and interop space, you were doing as much as them. So how's it going, Jim? Thanks for coming on.
I'm good, man. Thanks for having me on. I'm excited to have a good convo.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess just to kick things off, something that we like to do, like when you hear the word intent, like what do you think? Like, what is the first reaction in your head?
Oh man, I honestly don't even have a reaction because it's like so like abstract, right?
Yeah.
But I guess it would just be like, you know, what do you want to do? The users, I guess, like normal people is like my original reaction because it's just like, I mean, I don't know if I'm allowed to explain it, but it's just like ultimately the way in which lay people will like interact with blockchains, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good answer. Like, there's a lot of fancier things that people do. In my head, I always just think of it as like somebody wants some shit done, state what you want done, state how that is
Yeah,
verified. Anybody can go and do it for you, kind of like these almost like free markets for getting shit done. Um,
yeah. It's just like yeah, it's like said yeah, they're just like things. They're wants, they're something like that, right?
oh yeah, yeah. I mean, I guess most of us can focus on like interrupt and like that side of like utilizing intents. I think me and probably a lot of other people watched that video debrief that you did when the news came out about LiFi Card Catalyst, and I remember you kind of opened with something that resonates with a lot of people. There's a lot of fucking chains, like alt-VM bridging in particular, really sucks. And I think you said something like you guys could scale that business and focus on alt-VM stuff with Catalyst. So I guess just for viewers, like maybe a quick recap of like what the goal is with Catalyst and what your kind of final feelings were when it came to like the alt VM bridging stuff that you guys were focused on.
Yeah, so I think the right way to frame it is that I think when you're a founder, you kind of have like a problem to solve, right? And I mean, ideally, you continuously solve that problem because it's such an interesting problem that it's like all you think about and you want to like bet your career and your financial stability for it, right? And sure, like people pivot and maybe they even change the problem. For me, I've pivoted products, but have always tried to solve the same problem. And that problem is basically around with all these new chains that are popping up because it's become easier and easier to create rollups and chains with all these frameworks and all these services that we've seen the past 2.5 years. With all these chains popping up, how do we connect them all together, right? Or said differently, like, and this kind of came from my personal experience when I was at Aave, looking into proof of concepts of how to build Aave chain, which or Lens chain, which now they're coming into production in a couple of months. Um, like, what do you do after you launch the chain, right? Like, what do you do? Like, you click the button. It seems like this like big, awesome moment, but like you're it's like day zero. You're like, holy shit, now you get users and you get liquidity and you need to like connect other things, right? And so that was kind of like a huge roadblock for me when I worked at Aave, like coming up on 3 years ago at this point. And so yeah, that's just the problem that I've always been thinking about, right? And so when I started Catalyst, it would just like bug the shit out of me that like I wasn't able to, build Lens chain, Aave chain, etc. Because of this limitation. So I was like, fuck it, like I need to solve this. Like personally, I have like a vendetta against this concept, right? And so we launched Catalyst as a permissionless cross-chain AMM. And so there would be pools of assets that live on different chains that can all interoperate between each other and swap between each other, right? And so it's conceptually similar to Stargate, but far more extensible to a number of chains. the issue for that wasn't necessarily the actual connection of chains, it was the liquidity, right? And so we built this thing that like solved what we thought was the problem, but there was just another problem that was added on top of it that we kind of conflated as one problem, right? And so that was like the start of it, basically.
Got it. No, let's definitely talk more about that because I think that's probably true for most founders. It's like you go in, like you're building this thing, like that the problem that really ends up getting you or the problem that like takes up most of your sleep is like totally different from like maybe what you initially expected. And maybe this is aligned with it, but I know in that video you also mentioned like you guys thought you could scale this thing, and if you did, maybe you hit like 10 mil in volume for the bridge. And when I hear a stat like that, to like I think to the layperson, that's like sick. That's huge. Like that's amazing. Like why is that still maybe not enough? And maybe talk a bit more about those liquidity issues. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I think what you're touching upon is somewhat different, but they're both problems, right? So like there's this huge like almost ice block of problems that you think is one big problem, right? Which is like what I just articulated. And then you start like chipping away at it and you realize that like there's just other problems underneath the surface that you kind of have to deal with. And so there was a liquidity issue, which was a big issue for us that and it was such a big issue that we ultimately actually changed mechanisms. And so we went away from the AMM model and we embraced an intent based model. And so leveraging solvers and yeah, doing intents like we were talking about earlier. And so that was like a way to kind of bypass the liquidity constraints that we had with the AMM. But then you kind of find yourself in a number of other problems that you need to face, right? Um, but anyway, back to your point on like the announcement and why I said it was like a super bounded market opportunity was that the other problem that we had beyond just the liquidity issue was just the general market, right? It was like super crowded to be a Ethereum or an EVM compatible bridge. There was like there still is like 20, 25, 30 bridges that can move money between really popular rollups like Base and Arbitrum. And so if you're in that market and you're effectively doing the same thing, like sure, maybe it's like marginally faster, marginally more efficient or more liquidity efficient or what have you, you're still competing against it, right? And so we decided to zag where everyone's zigging and went to alt VMs. And we wanted to make a bet basically on all these other ecosystems that weren't really in the general mind share, didn't really see or had a lot of growth potential, but weren't really, competitive in terms of other bridges being there. And so we wanted to go to move chains, to SVM chains. We wanted to go to Tron, Ton, XRP, et cetera, right? And so that was kind of our zag. And even then, like these ecosystems are quite nascent, we would have a bounded success, right? And so 10 million was kind of a rough number that I threw out there. For context, I think the top bridges in the space every day move around 50 million to 80 million in volume. And obviously, hopefully that increases, every year as this becomes a more popular segment or vertical. And so if you're $10 million a day, you're kind of like a top 20 bridge, which is like fine, right? It's like fine to be that. And quite frankly, I would have loved to be that. But it just depends on like what aspirations you have as a founder. And I had larger aspirations. I don't think 10 million would have solved what I wanted to solve, right? Just tying it back to my previous framework. So I had higher hopes and aspirations for how to solve this problem. And that ultimately meant I had to team up with another company.
That's extremely powerful. And I think that's like something that you literally don't hear ever. It's like my goals are so big or your aspirations are so big. You care about solving the problem so much that even if it requires such drastic changes to your approach to the people that you work with, and I think being collaborative, which we did, like I guess Web3 has this ethos of being much more collaborative in other spaces, but it still is like startup, like many companies that are
Yeah.
fighting the same thing, especially as you mentioned in a very crowded bridging landscape. So that's extremely resonant. Before we dive a bit more into like, I guess I'll try to wrap it up with some more of like the philosophical thought processes. But before we dive into that, let's just like do a little bit more on the intents in bridging market today. When you think about those other competitors, one that just comes to mind because I met their team yesterday, Relay, like intent-based bridge, single solver. I think at least for me, like when I think about intents at a high level, I get excited about the idea of many solvers competing to go and do something. And in practice, that's not really the world that we live in. Like when a cross has 34-ish fillers, like
Yeah.
it's literally just one. And I know you touched on this in the video and other content. How do you view like other bridges in their landscape compared to like how you guys were envisioning like the solver side of things when it comes to that, either at Catalyst or at LiFi going forward? Yeah.
Yeah, I think the right way to think about this is that there's a world for a single solver system and a world for multi-solver system because they effectively do different things, right? I mean, of course, like functionally it's the same shit, but if you're a single solver, you're insanely liquidity constrained, right? So you're not actually going to be solving a lot of size necessarily. But because you're a single solver, you can be on new chains incredibly quickly and you actually have full control over order flow. There's no auction mechanism really. And so it gives you a lot of leeway in order to optimize for certain things, right? But ultimately, unless you have a lot of money, and even if you do have a lot of money, it's like still constrained in a number of ways. You kind of run into those inherent design constraints, right? And so for Relay, I applaud them; they are doing really well. It was kind of also a thought exercise of like, hey, what if we just like go full centralized, right? Like we issue like all the things for peer user experience, and Peter has wrote many threads about kind of the thought process behind that, which I've appreciated. And so that's them, right? Which is totally fine. I'm not knocking it at all. I think if you want to move more size, you're going to need more solvers ultimately, and you're going to need a way in order to select solvers, and so some sort of auction or selection mechanism, right? And also, if you want to be winning business that wants to move size, they're not going to want a single solver system, right? They want redundancy, they want decentralization, they don't want vendor lock-in in all intents and purposes. And so that is a different use case. And I think there's a world for both, basically.
Yeah, that's super well said. That makes a lot of sense. Like if you're a single, I guess like Relay, like relatively like consumer facing, like maybe not moving massive amounts of size, it makes sense to have a single solver that can quickly expand. They had an interesting point yesterday that I pushed them on like competition can maybe drive down prices when you think about what rates these solvers are willing to take. And he was like, people don't really care about that. Like our users just care about like they don't care if it's like a little bit longer or like slightly more expensive as long as they get that new asset that they really want to bridge to that they couldn't get before, which I thought was an interesting point. I guess yeah, I guess
Yeah.
transition a bit more towards like you guys and like the dream architecture on your end. But yeah, I guess in that video as well, there's this like division between Catalyst, Pioneer, Glacis, and I think like LiFi as a whole is it's like I guess like Jumper is a front end, LiFi is like an API that many people have already plugged into. Talk us through the players. So like for what you guys are building and what you're gonna get super pumped about and like what you're dedicating your time to now, like what is the stack?
Yeah. It's a bit complicated, honestly. Like hearing you play it back to me, I'm like, whoa, like we need to simplify the shit out of this. But for all intents and purposes, I think the right framing is that there's LiFi, the aggregator product slash business, and that is LiFi 1.0 for all intents and purposes, right? It was built kind of with the same mentality of Relay and Peter, is that they built something that just worked, right? And they basically did the hard work to brute force a ton of integrations in order to allow for this any token to any token on any chain swap interface that they have right now, right? With Jumper and also with all their enterprise integrations. There's a second separate product, LiFi 2.0, which they announced last week with this announcement, that is basically like a future proof evolution of LiFi 1.0, right? So it's taking all the similar parts of LiFi 1.0, but just like drastically simplifying it, standardizing it. And so it's an intent based mechanism that is that's modular and can include a lot of things that we think are missing right now within the intent space, which I can talk about in a second. And so that is LiFi 2.0, right? With Catalyst at its helm. So basically, we're taking Catalyst, we're taking its cross VM capabilities, and we're basically allowing it to go back to EVM and also generalizing it such that it could be more modular on a bunch of layers that we can talk about, like on validation, on rebalancing, on actually even the flow of funds, right? It could be a standard intent based lock, or it could be a fill first resource lock mechanism, which I know is picking up a lot of steam right now. So that's Catalyst. And there's also, like when you mentioned Pioneer and Glacis. And so Pioneer is basically a solver as a service, right? As you mentioned, solvers seem to be a bottleneck right now in this intent based mechanism. And so how do we lower that barrier and basically just offer solver as a service for people. And so that's what Pioneer is, right? Pioneer will also be a solver, not unlike Relay's mechanism, but its difference is that it lets anyone run it,
Hmm.
and it will also be on all these new chains, arguably even faster than Relay, right? And so that's kind of how we view Pioneer, and then it pioneers new chains, right? I didn't come up with the the name. That's someone more creative than me. And then lastly, of Glacis. So Glacis is a separate company actually, but we have a exclusive partnership with them, and basically they built this thing that allows for aggregation of all these cross chain token standards, and so it just allows for free flow of mint and burn tokens through all the chains that they support. And so again, if you revisit the problem that I talked about, all these new chains, how you connect them together, or maybe said in a more like user-centric way, how do you solve for a chain builder that just launched a chain or launch and roll up to connect all these things? You can see how all these pieces start solving that problem, right? You have Catalyst as the actual intent protocol that is able to support all these new chains. You have Pioneer as a solver as a service, so they become the de facto first solver within a lot of these new chains on top of Catalyst or below it, I guess. And then you have Glacis as well as a way to actually move even more liquidity than what a solver could into these new ecosystems.
That's a super comprehensive answer, and I think it makes sense. It's like each component, very modular style architecture. Start with one and then expand to more solvers. I had two random questions that we could maybe do a bit more rapid fire. Like on the standard side of things, like in my head, 7683, obviously across, and like all those guys have been pushing it. Really cool, really focused on cross chain swaps, super simple to understand. And I feel like the way Hart describes it in any talk is just like really clear to anyone. What are these other
Yeah.
standards that you're seeing? Like I get that like crypto does have this problem of like many standards everywhere, but in my head, like I guess immediate thought is like the solvers dictate what standards we even like think about or use. And in a world of like, there's a bit more out there. In a world of like LLMs, can't we just translate whatever request or need we have towards like any other standard that magically pops up? And I know that's like a little bit more like lots of elbow grease to get to that world, but like what does it mean to aggregate standards is I think sub question one.
Yeah. And I agree with a lot of your points. So I guess your question on aggregating standards, do you mean on the 7683 side, on the intent side, or do you mean on the cross chain token standard side? Like, just curious,
Got it.
standard means a lot of things.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I think seven, or I guess like honestly both. Like on the 7683 side, like is there anything else, or is it just like 7683 is sick and you guys want to keep working with that? And on the token side, I guess there is like a lot more variation.
Yeah. So I have like three answers basically. So one is that I think 7683 makes a lot of sense in terms of standardizing some sort of intent expression interface. So that's certainly needed. I think 7702 is really interesting. EIP 7702. So basically just kind of an evolution of ERC 4337, right? And allowing for more kind of um, better kind of smart contract capability that allows this EOA to effectively upgrade to a smart contract, or rather, you're passing the permission from an EOA to a smart contract or slash smart wallet. So that's really cool from a account abstraction, chain abstraction perspective, right? And Hart said in a talk, you're basically able to remote control other accounts on different chains or on the same chain using your existing EOA. So that allows for a lot more expressivity and programmability on that side, right? And so that's really really cool. And then lastly, there is this new framework that came out that we're publicly supporting called the Open Intents framework. And so it's led by the EF, but there's I think 30 some tweens, 40 some teams that are supporting it. And basically, it's a way for not only for us to rally behind 7683, but also to rally behind some other efforts on other parts of the cross chain stack. And I don't know how much I can share on that dimension, but basically, we're all fed up with all this broken UX bullshit, and we kind of just want to come together and fix the whole thing.
Oh yeah, no, that's sick. And it was crazy. Like wake up, see my Twitter feed, like open intents, like framework, EF is backing it. Like, damn, okay, this is cool. I know
Yeah.
Arbor had some cool thing a few weeks ago too. It's like clear that this is getting mainstream. You think about adoption. Final topic, then let's do like philosophical shit and like more rapid fire.
Mm-hmm.
Like when I'd be remiss not to talk about it, given that it's our whole excitement. When we think about much more complex intents or like stuff that even gets outside of crypto, like I always view intents as just like you are just codifying conditions that anyone can go and meet for you. And that can go far beyond like interop or cross chain swaps. Like in my head, this could be like rebalancing a portfolio, or it could be call
Yeah.
the smart contract every day, or it could be like, tell me if it's sunny in Denver. Like anything that you can write a proof for, you can create a market for. And then the solvers are no longer, let's say, market makers, but they could be other actors. What are your thoughts on all of that? Like, have you guys thought about like fancier intents? I know across in a lot of these, even CowSwap, they have like almost hooks. So it's like bridge and then call arbitrary call data. So you're
Yeah.
starting to get to more complex actions. But when you think about the future of intents in that realm, any thoughts or any plans?
Yeah, I think we're trending towards that direction. I even think the concept of hooks is like pretty rudimentary because it's basically just, you know, a multi-hop step, right? So it's like, I think Kane said it best from, Synthetics and Infinex. He called it a swidge, which is like a swap and a bridge, right? Which is like kind of what a hook is, basically. I like it because it's just a funny word. But I think we're at the cusp of far more interesting um, intents that could be expressed. I think there are some primary roadblocks to getting us there, but I think it's certainly a surmountable problem. So I think the first roadblock is just um, since every right now it's a very manual way to create new hooks, right, or zaps or whatever word you want to use. I think Enzo uses the word recipe, and so there's been a number of approaches on how to maybe not even make it easier to do these like contract integrations, but try to abstract in some way or try to scale it. And so Enzo is a great example, right? They have this network that incentivizes people to basically map on-chain actions. I think that's the word they use, actions or something. Again, it's there's a lot of nouns and verbs you can use for this shit. Um, and so that's super helpful. And I think there's other initiatives that try to incentivize people to do all that mapping and also to make on-chain discoverability a lot easier. Like this shit is super hard, right? It's like you have to like decode all these like hex strings and all this shit. But one of them is Wayfinder. I think what Wayfinder is doing is pretty interesting from a AI discoverability perspective. And then there's another project. I'm blanking on the name, but they're like Wayfinder esque. Basically, they're doing the same thing. It's Andrew Hong and a few
Yeah,
Dune alumni. Yeah. Heard is that what you said?
yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So that shit is super important, right? It's like once we make this like discoverable and to an extent human readable, that's really important. And then the second piece, and I think this is where agents become super important, is like, okay, like once we make this stuff discoverable, whether through, just like brute forcing it, like Enzo or some sort of more programmable way, then we just need people to like put all these things together, right? And Enzo is also doing that too with, I think they have like some sort of auction for these people to create bundles together. I think also that's where agents become really intelligent because they can just parse through a lot more options than just a standard, of course, a standard human, even a standard solver build. And so it gets really interesting, right? Both leveraging AI and both fronts. And so once we get to that, then it's like like all hell breaks loose, and we like fucking send UX. Like the UX is just going to be like crazy, basically.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. Yeah, I mean, in the final few minutes, like just I guess talking about the founder journey and crypto experience, because I do think like you've been really candid about your journey, and it's helped. Like, it's been cool for me to watch it. I know like a lot of other people in crypto, it's been cool to see. Like, sub question one, like, how'd you get into crypto? Like, how'd you even get into all this shit? Yeah.
Yeah, I got into crypto for two reasons. So one, super tactically, was like I found out about it my freshman year in university because a dude in my hall was like a huge seller on Silk Road,
Oh
and
wow.
so he just like filled me on this like vision, and obviously it was like super like tactically beneficial for him and for my friends. So that was like how I found out about it. But I think like the more emotional underpinning was that I grew up sending a lot of money back home to my family in China, and that would be like probably the most painful experience I've like in terms of sending money, because obviously we're Chinese, and we don't want to pay like the standard MoneyGram rates, which are like highway robbery. And so we would like have stacks of cash that I would like drive to like an auntie's house, and she would just like take it, and then she would like WeChat her friend in China to like withdraw from the bank for like whatever spot amount we agreed on. And that was like crazy. We did that like every month, right? And so hearing about Bitcoin and then eventually about other blockchains and That really excited me, right? So payments has always been my emotional core use case for crypto.
Yep, that's super cool. Origin story, super cool. I guess sub question too, like a little bit more about the future of the journey. What's your like dream for the end of 2025? It's like December 31st, and you look back at like how this year has gone. Like I guess still relatively early compared to like how big like this thing can go when you think about interop and LiFi, just intents in general. Like maybe like a couple things that you would love to hit, or like you think like this would be really sick.
So I think the big thing, which is also kind of like self congratulatory in a number of ways, is solving interop, right? Like what we said, like what I said, like I think we're in the cusp of solving a lot of this stuff. Like people don't like bridging, right? Bridging is not something that the end person wants to be doing. They don't want to go to a cross or Stargate and do a bridge, right? They want to just do whatever the fuck they want on chain, and they let some infrastructure handle how they want to move funds, right? They don't want to care about ETH on all the 50 plus rollups that we have in production, right? And so I think we're really, really close to that. Like genuinely, I think all the pieces can come together. I think it's a matter of coordination. So that's where the OIF is super helpful, and also just like adoption, honestly, like brave people that want to take the leap and ultimately get order flow. So that's really what I want to see. And I think it's going to happen, honestly. And I'm okay being wrong because I'm too optimistic than being wrong because I'm too pessimistic. So that's one thing. The second thing is that I think I want to see a reemergence of true like experience innovation or experimentation. I think we kind of lost that in the last year and a half. Of course, we have meme coins, and they're kind of like an interesting pattern or anti-pattern, depending on who you ask. Um, but if you go back to like DeFi summer, it was like money Legos. Like we were creating some like really weird shit. Like we made like a bunch of synthetic stuff. Like we made Alchemex, which is, combine a bunch of money Legos. I do think Morpho is interesting in practice. So, that's not a DeFi summer thing, but it's just a random thought I wanted to add to it thematically. And so I want to see that again. I think we have so many really cool pieces that we can put together. Like, quite frankly, now that I'm not a founder anymore, I luckily have a few hours of free time, and I try to dedicate that just to like build on some of this stuff. Like some of these like stablecoin payment SDKs are like insane. Like it's far easier than ever to like deploy a smart contract or integrate a smart contract and combine a bunch of them together. And so we can start doing some like wacky shit. And I'm just like hoping for people who feel the same way as myself to just like start experimenting.
Oh yeah, no, I completely agree. And on the stablecoin point, it's like I think Bridge has been insane. Like I switched bank providers from Mercury to Meow, and these guys just hustle and ship, and they just have a Bridge integration natively, so I don't have to like balance a bunch of multi-sigs and my bank account, just like USDC back and forth instantly. Final question. I know advice is usually controversial, but I think this might be one that you're uniquely positioned to give advice on. Like when you think about that transition from like Catalyst to LiFi, like at a personal level, but also at a team level, like talking to the folks that you've rallied behind you for this mission. Goal is of course still the same at LiFi in many ways, but like talk me through like personal battles and overcoming that when you think about that literal transition. Like in my head, it's like it's always a roller coaster, like building any of this, and there's always ups and downs, and it frankly just seems like it gets more extreme every day. But when you think about like that clear transition that you all made, like any advice to others that are maybe in a similar position or thinking about like a super competitive market, where do I go, or like what's the scope of how big I can make this, and yeah, that's just given that specific side of things. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm going to give you somewhat of a borderline unhelpful and philosophical answer as opposed to a super tactical one.
Sure.
But I think it's still helpful, hopefully. So I think when you're a founder, you either already believe or you train yourself to believe that you are like the motherfucking shit, right? Like you alone, with your team and your co-founders, but you alone can do this, right? You're going to beat all the competition. You're going to make something new. You're going to win all these users. You're going to gain all this adoption. It's it's a singular journey, right? And that's kind of the mental state that you're conditioned to be in, especially if you've been doing it for multiple years. And it's really hard to admit to yourself that that might not be true, right? It might be better to be acquired. It might be better to merge, right? It might be better to join forces with someone. And so for me, that was really hard because I've always bet on myself, especially as a founder and, even before then, but always bet on myself, like maximum risk, swing for the fences. Let's try to overhire someone who's super overqualified with like the shitty budget that we have as a seed stage startup, and you end up getting them, right? And so you have a lot of proof points of betting yourself. And this is kind of like going away from that, right? You're like, oh, I don't want to bet on myself anymore. I want to, because logically and even sometimes emotionally, it's the right thing to do. And I think you just have to be really honest with yourself on backing away from that and knowing that it's okay, because you can have multiple shots at building companies. Or, as I've kind of tried to psyop myself, I'm ultimately a servant to the problem and the product more than titles and egos.
That's really well said. I think you're right. It's like an answer that I think for any founder, it's like a lot to digest and think about, but it is the life. Like you have to be so confident in yourself. At the same time, you have to be so ruthlessly like critical of kind of like the current state of things and where you're at relative to others. So that's a great way to end it. Really appreciate the time, Jim. Super good conversation, and I'm sure that we'll do a lot more going in the future. And excited for all things intense, LiFi, interop, etc.
Thanks, man. Thanks for having me.
Awesome.